Hello and welcome to my hobby table once again for yet another bearing removal and installation video featuring Boca bearings. Now I've been doing these videos for Boca for several months now, and I'm sure many of you have realized or noticed that my first videos were simply installation videos, and then gradually they've kind of morphed into bearing removal and installation videos, and maybe in the last couple I've actually started adding just a hair more information about the engine, its construction, or its condition, which is of paramount importance when you go to remove bearings. So while I'm never going to incorporate full disassembly or full reassembly into these bearing installation, removal, and installation videos, I do like to at least touch on a little bit of the known history that I have about these engines and at least show some of the condition issues so you can understand that not all engines are super easy to get the bearings in and out of. Some of the engines I service are very pristine, while others are a little bit more like today's engine. And today's engine is an Enya 45CX engine. So with that said, let me swing this to the table so we can take a quick look at the condition of this engine just prior to me setting up the table for bearing removal and installation. Okay, so here on the table is the disassembled Enya 45CX engine that I'm going to do a bearing removal and installation on. And you can see this engine is pretty rough. It's quite dirty, I should say. It feels really rough. Look how dirty this top is. So I've got my ultrasonic cleaner with a new set of cleaners going in there and warming up. Now here's the top of the piston. Now this is pretty tight too. So it's in pretty used shape, well used shape. Now this engine features what's called, the construction of this engine is called AAC, which is an aluminum sleeve that's chrome plated with an aluminum piston, instead of ABC, where you've got the steel sleeve that's chrome plated with the aluminum piston. And I kind of knew that right away before looking at the video, or before looking at the review, because this sleeve is just very light. So real quickly here, more of how this engine came to me. I'm going to see if I can salvage this gasket. But the other thing that was unfortunate, because I love Enya engines, is that this has got a couple of broken head fins on here. Fortunately, I was able to source a brand new head for this, and this actually might be going to a friend of mine, Jay, to get vapor honed and cleaned up and looking all new again. So let me set up the table for the bearing removal, and then we'll do the removal and installation. Okay, so here on the table I've got everything I'm going to need, I believe, to do this bearing removal portion of this video. I've got the very gummed up, dirty crankshaft, crankcase, and I've oiled it a little bit with some penetrating oil to help me get that out. I've got my wood block that's going to enable me to tap this crankshaft out with the hammer, and then of course I've got my flat nose punch that will enable me to at least get the front bearing out. The question is going to be, does that rear bearing come out with the crankshaft, and or am I going to have to employ other methods to get that out? I've also got my desk vise, my heat resistant glove, which I'm putting on right now, and my temp gun, heat gun, that I can heat this thing up. Now this drive washer on here is not held in with a Woodruff key, but it's held in with it's got two flats on it. Right now it's held in place just by the sheer force of the dried oil, and it doesn't have gripping surfaces for me to use my bearing puller on it, or gear puller, so I'm just going to have to tap that, and that'll come off as I am tapping this crankshaft out. Hoping that's enough. So let's see. So there's our drive hub that came off. Let's see if, okay, that came out. Let's see, bearing came out with it. So that's a beautiful thing. So the bearing came out with the crankshaft. Wow, look at that crankshaft. That's really gnarly looking. So that'll be a different thing for us to try to get off of there. I like that better than when the bearing stays inside here. I like that better than when the bearing stays inside here because it's rather challenging sometimes. And so I'm just going to put my punch in here right on the edge of this bearing and get this front bearing out. Maybe I didn't get this heated up enough. It's moving now. Just there we go. Okay, there's our front bearing. It's out. So the means that I'm going to employ to get this bearing off of here is I'm just going to stand this crankshaft up like this and just tap this thing and hold it with my gloved hand here. It's not really that hot, but and just kind of rotate it around until I can start to get this thing to loosen up. And I actually have to heat this up because it doesn't feel like it was wanting to come off. There we go. Okay, so now it's coming off. And this is one of those operations when you're changing the bearings, you can be a little rough with the bearing. It's because it's going to get thrown away. Okay, so there's our bearings off of this engine. I don't need this glove on anymore. Here's that crankshaft. It's really dirty. It's going to get all nice and cleaned up. And here are these really gnarly looking bearings. Wow, this one doesn't even hardly turn at all. So these are going to go straight to the dumpster and get replaced. So I'm going to go and clean up all these parts and then we'll adjourn for now, and then I'll come back when all these parts are cleaned up and new bearings are ready to be installed. Okay, I just want to do a quick show and tell here. These parts just came out of the ultrasonic cleaner, and the cleaner that I'm currently using now is something that was given to me by a really good friend. His name's Mike, and it's called ZEP Formula 15228, I believe it is, and it's a powder, and it works wonderfully in the ultrasonic cleaner. So if you recall from just the other segment here where I was showing you how these parts look, they look so much better. In fact, I think this looks so good that it is not going to require any vapor honing at all. I think this is clean enough and looks beautiful enough to my satisfaction. The sleeve came out pretty well. There's still a little bit of carbon on the top here. I'm not worried about that. It's not going to affect anything. This rear cover was pretty gnarly. Looks really good. Now the piston, it came pretty clean, but I'm not entirely gonna sit here and try and get all that off because you don't ever want to do anything to the sides of an AAC or an aluminum piston anyway that has no ring, and it's really not necessary. If anything, a little bit of carbon residue is only going to add to the compression of the engine. But the connecting rod is nice and free and cleaned up, and everything is good. So let me just go ahead and move these parts out of the way and we'll get set up for the bearing installation. Okay, so here on the table I've got everything necessary for this bearing installation. I've got this beautifully cleaned up Enya 45CX crankcase, and this thing really cleaned up nice. I'm impressed. I was using only the ultrasonic cleaner with a product called ZEP Formula 15282, I believe is what it is. It's a powder that you put in your ultrasonic cleaner, and it's aluminum safe and does one heck of a job. So I've got that. I've got my cleaned up crankshaft here. This crankshaft cleaned up very nicely thanks to, in large part, to a buddy of mine, Harvey, who gifted me an early Christmas present of a 6-inch bench grinder with a nice brass bristle wheel used to polish up steel parts, and this thing just looks spectacular. Also on the table I've got my wood block to help me tap that crank or the front bearing in, hammer, my socket extension, a small screwdriver, precision screwdriver to remove any seals or shields that might be necessary, my bearings, and I've got a jar here that I always use, this little glass jar, and I like to use Lightning Lube Road Power from Boca as my reassembly lube, especially for bearings, and I usually just put one pump inside here, and that's enough to lubricate all of my parts up for this bearing installation and even for complete reassembly of the engine, my desk vise, my glove, and my heat gun. So with that said, let me go ahead and talk about these bearings. So the kit number for this engine, or this, yeah, for this engine is ENK-001. So let's see what the bearings look like. So the rear bearing is going to have double rubber seals. Rubber ones are seals, metal ones are shields. And of course this front bearing I can already tell is the ZZ, which denotes the steel shields. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to lightly remove those, but first I think I'm going to go ahead and lubricate all my parts up here. And I'll just use my finger and just liberally lubricate all of these mating surfaces. And I like to do this on the crankcase, and as long as I'm in the crankcase I like to just kind of get everything in there, especially where the sleeve is going to go back in. So that's all done. As long as I'm lubricating things, I might as well go ahead and put it on here, and then I'll remove the seals and or shields. So the original bearings that came out of this engine were open on both sides for the rear, and the front, as normal, is sealed on, or shielded on one side and open on the rear. So I'm going to reproduce that exact scenario here. Now, since this is a rubber sealed bearing, these rubber seals can actually be reused if you were to use a bearing that doesn't work in an application like this, where you can actually just go in there and re-grease it. So getting the seal out is just the same as getting the shield out, but you just use a heck of a lot lighter touch. Not like I'm going to put these back on, but I just want to demonstrate that these are serviceable bearings, and if you're careful, you can reuse that seal should you service the bearing. So the seal does have a little bit of a metal ring, but it's coated with rubber, so it is possible to deform that if you're not really careful. So just keep in mind that if you're removing the seals, rubber seals on a bearing, just be much lighter with your touch there so that you don't damage them. Sometimes I like to keep those just in case. Now for the shields, this is a destructive process for the shield. So you're going to destroy the one shield, and you have to use a lot firmer puncture there to get in there and lift that out. So you can see here that I've completely deformed that, so that's no longer usable. So now these set of bearings are ready to be installed. So what I like to do is I'll always install the front bearing first, and that always acts as a centering mechanism for part two, which is I always put the rear bearing on the crankshaft. Now sometimes these can be a little tight going over the opening here, the port. So I'm going to just kind of use my fingers on the outer race and just tap that into place like that. Sometimes it can be, those edges can be really sharp, and that can really kind of catch on the bearing sometimes. But so as I was saying, I put the front bearing in first, and then that way installing the rear bearing, it acts as a centering mechanism. So I'm going to move that out of the way, wipe my fingers off, put my glove on, heat this case up, and get these bearings installed. Should not take a whole lot of heat. See, that should be enough. Let's turn it this way. Set that in place. And there we go. It's still pretty warm. It might be warm enough to install this rear bearing also. Hopefully it is. That is where I use my beat up socket extension as my drive. And you can kind of tell when it's fully seated by the sound of that last tap. And I think we need to go another tap here. There we go. And there we go. Installed and ready to rock and roll again. And that's all there is to removing and installing the bearings in this Enya 45CX engine.